Hello there. Welcome to this episode of Just a Few. My name is Patrick Antoine, your host on this platform, which allows me the opportunity to provide biblical responses to questions from people just like you. If you have a question and you want me to attempt a response to that question, please feel free to submit your question, preferably via email. The email address is on the screen, and I will try my best to provide a response to you as soon as I can. Today's question has to do with something that is mentioned very often in the Old Testament. And the question is, what was a high place? And that's an expression we find very often in the Old Testament. So I could give a simple one-line answer and get it over and done with. But if I do that, not only does it sound blunt and disrespectful, I believe, I think it also opens the door for people sending back questions and for more explanation. So I'm going to do more than just give you a simple one-liner type of answer. I'm going to give you a little bit of a comprehensive understanding of what these places were all about. And so let me just read some of the things I've jotted down here. So the expression high place, or the plural form high places, can be found almost 100 times in the Old Testament. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it could be 99 times. They were called high places. These sites were called high places because they were usually elevated places of worship used by both Jews and Gentiles. Yes, Jews used them also. And they use them to offer sacrifices and offerings or perform religious rituals. So the origin of this preoccupation with doing worship in these elevated places may be traced all the way back to Genesis 10, to a site called the Tower of Babel. And there you'll find that the people met on a plain, a valley, and they decided to erect this structure, and they had a tower that was supposed to try to get as close to heaven as possible. So let me just read one verse there for you to start. Genesis 11:4 is where you'll find that, and the Bible says, "And they said," the people said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." So they wanted to build this elevated structure, a tower that would reach up as close as possible to the clouds or into the heavens, as they thought. So that's believed to be, that is the biblical origin of these elevated places of worship. When you go and you follow the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, when they were in the wilderness, in the plains of Moab, there was a king of Moab named Balak who wanted to bring a curse upon the children of Israel. So he hired this man who was a sorcerer named Balaam. And Balaam was invited, and we'll notice that the Moabites took Balaam to these high places from which he could see Israel and pronounce the curses upon them from there. That's how high sometimes these high places could have been. That's found, one instance is in Numbers 22, verse 41. It says, "So it was the next day that Balak took Balaam and brought him up to the high places of Baal." It's a deity that the Moabites and many other people worship. So there were these high places where they would worship. Why? That from there he might observe the extent of the people of Israel. So Balaam went up to these high places on a mountaintop, and sometimes people had them on areas where they would trees, a grove of trees, and they would build high places, or it might be on their rooftops, any type of elevated place. So when the Israelites left Egypt and entered the promised land, the Canaanites had high places all over the country, all over the land. God told the children of Israel to destroy those places of pagan worship because the practices were abominable and even satanic. So it was not a question of the physical structure, the high place, but about what types of worship went on there that led God to tell them, destroy those high places. And look at, for instance, Numbers 33, verse 52. It says, "Then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, destroy all their engraved stones, destroy all their molded images, and demolish all their high places." And you'll notice that I said earlier, it's both Jews and Gentiles were known for having these elevated places of worship. Yeah, even Jews. So again, it's not about the physical site, it's about what it was used for, the type of worship that went on those sites. So before the temple was constructed in Jerusalem, the tabernacle was set up at a place called Gibeon. And even Samuel worshipped at a high place. And later, King Solomon, just before the temple was built and dedicated, he made sacrifices and offerings at that same high place in Gibeon where the Jews had their tabernacle at the time. So you'll have to read 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10, and you'll see when Samuel met Saul, Samuel went to worship at a high place. You see Solomon offering worship in Gibeon at a high place in 2 Chronicles chapter 1 verse 3. So the Jews had these places and they offered worship there before the temple was built. So let me read one reference for you there in the days of Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 3 verses 2 and 3 says, "Meanwhile the people sacrificed, people of Israel, at the high places, because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places." Now the temple is built. There was supposed to be one centralized place of worship, and the Jews were no longer allowed to have these high places as different places of worship throughout their nation. They had one place of worship, the temple in Jerusalem. In closing, it is interesting that when we get into the New Testament, we don't see anything mentioned about high places, and neither do you see Christians being told to, wherever you go, demolish those high places. And so, because it's not about the physical place, so that it's not that there weren't any physical high places anymore. All over the Roman Empire, they had paganism. But Christians are not told to do what the Jews were told to do when they went into the promised land. So don't use that as justification. Oh, we need to go to those places where people worship like that and tear down their altars and destroy it. We don't see that in the New Testament, and there's a reason for that. And let me mention this. As followers of Christ, we are not called upon to physically tear down or cast down anyone's physical places of worship. Definitely not forcibly. However, we understand the need to engage in spiritual conflicts against the spiritual entities which keep people bound and blinded, meaning the realities of spiritual forces behind the pagan worship that God was making sure Israel didn't enter into. So I close with this verse with the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 5. He says, talks about casting down. That's like they were told to cast down or destroy the physical altars under the old covenant. Casting down arguments and every high thing, not high place, but every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. That's what we cast down. So I said, I'm going to make sure I don't get questions follow up. And so I'm hoping what I shared, in addition to you understanding these were elevated places of worship, high places, need to understand the purpose of it. It was for worship, mostly pagan worship, but even the Jews at one point worshipped with the tabernacle there in Gibeon at a high place. But as Christians, I'll add to that we are not called to do what Israel did in demolishing and casting down, destroying physical places of worship. We cast down the spiritual entities and realities which are behind these things. And so that's my response to what high places were, and I trust that the additional information help you to understand how we ought to treat with those type of concepts and so on today. My name is Patrick Antwine. Thank you for the question. Hopefully my answer cleared up any doubts in your mind about what those places were and how they are to be treated. So until the next time, grace and peace